Welcome. This is the first chapter lecture over our social problems class. We are going to go ahead and get started here. So this is chapter 1. It's an introductory chapter talking about what is sociology and actually zeroing in on the study of social problems. The idea being that sociology is a general sort of umbrella, and underneath that is social problems. So what is sociology? So sociology is a systematic study. It means it's kind of planned out and you're going according to the plan. It's systematic. It's systemic. You're not doing a random study, I guess you would say, of individuals, groups, and social structures. Social structures would be things like the government or families or the economy, things of that nature. Analysis of relationships between the individuals and society. My dad explained this to me when I was pretty young, that sociology, well, no, we'll start with psychology. Psychology asks why people lose their minds, why the people have mental health breakdown. Sociology asks why didn't everyone else have a breakdown? We're trying to understand that relationship between me as an individual and what's going on around me with other people, and how am I being impacted by what other people are doing. And if you look at my life and what I'm dressing and how I'm speaking and what I'm doing as compared to everybody else, what you're going to notice is I'm basically doing the exact same thing with my own sort of flavor perhaps, or personality, but the reality is most of what I do is very, very similar to other people. So what's the impact of society on me? A lot. It's really, really strong. Right? I don't like to think that, because in America we have a culture of individualism, and we like to, talk about ourselves as being, like independent and not going according to the group and creating my own way. Whereas maybe like in Asia, they're much more like happy or satisfied, I guess, saying, no, I'm actually doing what the group wants me to do, whereas Americans were not comfortable saying that. So, all right, obviously I'm speaking very generally, so, and I'll do that the rest of the chapter. I'll do that the rest of the semester. I speak generally. There are obviously exceptions to everything that I'm saying, but in general. And then we're going to analyze the role of the social structures in problems and in, let's see, and their solutions, right? They're throwing in this term globalization right here. I'm not sure why, but this is the process of increasing trans-border connectiveness. All right, so in the past, countries kind of existed in much more isolation. If you were living in Greece, you didn't really know what was going on in Japan, and it didn't really impact you that much because you were so far away, and maybe you didn't really care because you never would go there and you wouldn't receive, like Japanese goods like you would today, and so today we have a much more globalized world where we're, designing the car in Japan, and we're building the parts in Mexico, and we are assembling the parts in Houston, or Marion. And so this is the process of globalization. We have a lot more connected. What happens in China matters a lot in the United States. All right, this is a term that is really important, but maybe not as clear when you first learn about it. The sociological imagination. It's this link between the individual, the personal experience, and the social world. Right? So how is my personal experience related to the social world? So I could look at me right now and what I'm doing, right? So how did I become a teacher, right? How did I become to be able to interact with people via the internet and have, those fancy equipment that I get to use, and what's that between our social world? Well, a lot, actually. The connection in our economy, we have a knowledge economy where most people aren't factory workers or they're farmers. We do things where we exchange information, knowledge, And so people are encouraged to do that. And so if you would like to be, financially successful, then you get education and you use microphones and the internet. And so I didn't just like choose all these things on my own, independent of my social world. My social world kind of dictated the boundaries. And of course I could violate them or try to get around them, but that's very difficult and most people are going to fail at it. And so so using your sociological imagination, what's the link between me and my job and the social world? It's really strong. It encouraged me to pursue education. It encouraged me to learn how to use software and video editing and things like that. So specifically when it comes to social problems, the issue of sociological imagination asks, well, what is going on because, say, me as an individual have a problem, and what is my and what is my fault? My problems. Let's say, what's my fault, and what's this kind of the society's fault? So I don't know. Let's say I'm arguing with my spouse, right? That's my personal trouble. It's not, but we'll pretend. Then what is that? Because maybe I'm a jerk, and what is the social, the public issue, And so you could say, well, in today's society, both spouses are encouraged to work, and so that's going to reduce the amount of energy that they have to, say, clean the house and cook supper. And so you're kind of setting up a situation where there are things that are maybe not going to get done that are going to create problems for the family. And we all have these, like cell phones, which, get in the way of our face-to-face interactions. And so that's a social issue because it's almost the expectation that we all have one of those in order to communicate. And so what is my problem because it's me, and what is my problem because it's a public issue? It's kind of hard to know. That's why they call it the imagination, because it's like, just try to imagine, you don't really know, at least you never really know, like what is the problem because of the person, and what is the problem because of the society. Well, some people will argue one, other people will argue the other. It's probably a combination of both, but I think that the purpose is to have you imagine and think about it. Because let's say you're a politician and you're the mayor and you want to solve divorce rates, you want them to go down. Well, you could, if you think about it just from a personal perspective, you'd be like, well, you need to change the people. But if you think about it from a public issue, it's like, oh, okay, so maybe if we reduced the work week from 35 hours to 34, I don't know, then, or from 40 to 35, I don't know, then that would actually help marriages. Or if you made housing cheaper because you encouraged builders to build more housing, that's going to drive down the cost of housing. And so couples are going to have more financial freedom, and they're going to go on more dates, and they're just going to feel less stressed. And so that's going to help marriages. So that is a public issue that you could deal with. So anyway, I beat this horse to death. I'm going to move on. Negative consequences of social problems. So a social problem, by definition, is a social condition that has negative consequences for the individuals, our social world, or the physical world. So some sort of social condition, right? Divorce. Although I guess you could argue that divorce is not a social problem, because some people would say this is a freedom, a ticket to freedom. But I don't know. Not getting enough exercise, having an unhealthy population, that's a social problem, right? That most people would agree with. And it has negative consequences because we have more diabetes, and we have more heart disease, and we have, I don't know, perhaps more anxiety because we're not healthy, right? So yeah, that's our definition of social problem. All right, when we're studying social problems, there's three terms here that are important to understand, two especially, and there's the objective reality, and that is sort of like what a video camera would capture. Or you could say it's just the numbers, you know? So if I say 3,000 people died today of heart disease, that's the objective reality. We know that a particular social condition exists. Okay, but that's kind of cold, and you know, we may not feel very much or be, you know, wanting to move on that. And so there's a subjective reality, and the subjective reality is this idea that we are going to call it a problem, and we're going to say that something should be done about it, right? And typically the subjective, you know, refers to, you know, somebody's personal experience. Like, I lost a grandmother to heart disease, and this is what it was like. And that makes me want to say that we as a society need to change it. So I guess I should probably think of something that is not a social problem, but that it could be a social problem, you know, like, I don't know. People don't drink enough tea. You know, like you could define that and say, like, the objective reality is the average American does not drink any tea today. That's an objective reality. But is that a social problem? Well, no, it's not. Why not? Because we haven't defined it as a problem, right? That because the subjective reality says it's not a problem. Let me think of a better example here. Child abuse. Child abuse has always existed. That's the objective reality. People have always beat their children, right? But it didn't become a social problem until I think the 1960s. Why? Did it change? No. People beat their children in the 1960s the same way they beat them in the 1950s, 1940s. But we began to define it as a social problem. And that's this idea of social construction. The idea of social construction is that we are building, as a society, we're saying, okay, this thing that we didn't used to define as a problem, hitting one's child, we used to just say, like, well, it's people parenting, or the child screwed up, or, you know, things are going to go bad, you know, like, you know, parents are going to treat their kids bad. It's just kind of part of life. It's none of my business. That was, you know, previous to that, that was probably the thought of most Americans. But then as a society, we constructed these as problems. And we said, okay, we have broken bones, we have scars, we have burns. We always had those objective realities, but now we're going to redefine it as a problem. And it actually came about, this specific problem with child abuse. It became about because technology changed. We started using these bone scanners, I think that's what it was called, and it allowed doctors to be able to see if there was long-term damage, and not just like, oh, this thing happened this one time, and we can see the break, but we actually can see it progressing over a long time. So technology changed. Psychiatry began to be a more prominent field, and so psychiatrists took up the cause of child abuse, and so then we began to build, socially construct this as being a problem. All right. The history of social problems, this just tries to understand the stages, like how does something go from being not a social problem to actually being a social problem, right? So, you know, again, the objective reality is oftentimes there for much longer than it is considered a social problem. You know, so people have been having heart disease forever, but at some point we decided it was a social problem. Lung cancer was there forever until we decided that smoking was a social problem, right? Hatred toward people of the, you know, LGBTQ community has been happening for a long time, but at some point we decided to make it a social problem or consider it a social problem. So this just tries to understand that process. So in stage one, we're transforming it from a private problem into a public one. You know, before it was just, hey, it's a personal problem, or hey, it's just what it is what it is, kind of a thing. Just saying, no, it's actually a public issue. It's not an individual problem. Stage two, legitimization process. We are formalizing the manner in which social problems or complaints generated by the problem are handled. We're saying we're not just going to take this problem and kind of throw it under the rug anymore. We're actually going to kind of move it up the chain and have the authority figures, whoever they are, look at it and say, okay, this is an issue. This is a problem. Stage 3, conflict stage, where people renegotiate. Okay, so in the past, here's how we've dealt with this. Here's how we've thought about this. And now we're going to change into thinking about it and dealing with it different. Right? Stage 4, when a group believes they can no longer work within the established system and either must radically change the system or work outside of it. Right? So you're changing the systems to accommodate for this renegotiating of the issue. Right? Maybe at this point laws are passed or agencies are created or there's educational campaigns to educate people on how to respond to this differently than the past. Functionalist perspective. Okay, so I think there's 3 or 4 perspectives that we're going to talk about in this chapter. And a perspective is kind of like sunglasses. I don't think I have any. Sunglasses are just a way of looking at the world. The world stays the same. You see it differently depending on the perspective that you take. So the first one is the oldest one is the functionalist perspective, and it says society is like a body. And within the body, you have certain parts. The body has organs, and those parts do certain functions. Like the family has children, raises those children, passes them on to the education sector. The education sector is another part, and it educates them and prepares them to be a citizen, to be a worker. Then the economy, then kind of takes them and produces goods and services, provides tax dollars for the government, provides income for the families, provides goods and services for the populace, things like that. And then they work together. Just like you breathe in air and that goes into your lungs, and then your lungs passes that to your heart, and your heart pumps that, through the blood vessels to all the different cells. The different cells do their functions to keep the whole body in balance and working well. And so, where do problems come in? Well, one time problems can come in when you have a rapid change that threatens the social order. Right, just that disrupts this balance within society, right? So a rapid change would be like a communication change, So, I've heard once somebody say that every time we have a major communication change, we have a big war, So like the printing press, heavily impacted the Reformation, and we are going through a lot of social problems today, and you could argue that's related to the fact that, again, we all now have smartphones in our pockets, and we are no longer just consuming media, we're creating media. It used to be that if you wanted to publish your information to the world, you had to go through a publisher, a movie company. Well, now with Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, everyone can become a publisher of information. And so it's creating a lot of problems. We have a lot of distrust of the government, distrust of other institutions. We have a lot more polarization where, one political party really, really distrusts the other political party. So people aren't sure what the rules are. Like how do I find a mate? What do I do with my life? I'm not sure what the rules are anymore in terms of things like gender and things related to race and education. And there's a lot of people today where like, I don't know what the norms are. I don't know what's normal, what to call people, like how to interact with the world. So functionalists would argue this is because we've had such rapid social change. All right, this is a macro level perspective, and what that means is it looks at society from the group perspective. So it has a bird's eye view of, it focuses on how society creates and maintains social order. Within your body, if one of your body parts becomes infected, other body parts will send extra energy and resources to that area. That's what swelling is about. You're sending extra blood, and T cells, which is the immune system, to that area to try to help it out, to try to balance it. If you hurt your left leg, your right leg is likely to compensate for that. And so in the same way, our society does that. If the family is struggling, then the education sector takes on more responsibility for things like child rearing and teaching them. So, all right. Obviously, we can have problems within society, and Robert Merton calls these dysfunctionalism, and that these are negative because they create imbalance, but they also create positive consequences. So for instance, if society needs to change, then this dysfunction can bring about that positive change in society. All right, moving on. Conflict perspective. Conflict perspective is Karl Marx's ideas put into action. He obviously started it, and it's been taking on new directions since he wrote about it. And whereas functionalism says that society is cooperating one part to the other, conflict theory says actually it's at war one part to another. But he says that there's really only two main groups, and those are the people who own the factories and the restaurants and the natural resources, and then everybody else who works for those, what he called the means of production. The means of production is like the ways in which you produce things, so factories and businesses, governments. And so he says society is held together through power and coercion. Coercion I think of as like someone twisting my arm and getting me to do what they want because they're coercing me. If you don't do this, then I'm going to, break your arm. Well, that's I'm doing it, but I'm doing it only because I feel like I don't really have a freedom to not do that. So you have conflict between. Today I think of it as between the rich and the poor. I know that's not exactly what he meant, but you could think of it that way. And in case you're wondering, well, who's rich and who's poor? According to this, you could think about this as, 99% of us are poor, 1% of us are rich. And so unless you are like you own a major part of a corporation, or you're connected to government in some, powerful way, you're working for a living. And who are you working for? You're working for the powerful group. You're working to make them money. And so there's a conflict between you as a worker and your boss or the company. And so the biggest social problems from this perspective is that the system itself, you have the system of coercion. People would say, I don't really want to work for, I don't know, the store that I'm working for because it's boring. And but why do you work there? Well, because I have to. I don't have any other choice. I have to put, bread on the table. And so, Karl Marx say it's the system itself, that needs to be changed. And then the inequality, where you have some people that just have so much, and most of us have fairly little compared to them, and so they have all this power to influence government and get their way, and we have fairly little, and so it creates this animosity, this anger between us and them. All right, I mentioned Karl Marx is the father of conflict theory. He wrote this when he was seeing the Industrial Revolution come into being. And he was German, and so he's watching people who used to be on the farms move to the cities and work in the factories, long hours with very little protections for their jobs or their futures or their children. And he says, this is all of life, is this conflict between people who are forced to work jobs that they aren't necessarily wanting to work, and all their hours and their pay and their conditions is all dictated by the boss. And so So, and he said, he went as far as here as to say, you know what, the system, which he called capitalism, which was actually intended to be more of like a derogatory word, but is changed in its meaning since he created it, it alienates people because it disconnects us from other people, and it disconnects us from what we were kind of meant to be, which is connected and doing something that's really means something to us. And it not only alienates us as you know, he would call the proletariat, the workers, but also the boss, the bourgeoisie. And it makes them, they're also disconnected from the people who work for them and their own potential. So that's why he really believed that the whole system needed to be changed. And that's probably why people don't like Karl Marx, because his, you know, the change was that he had to tear the whole thing down and restart so that everybody is, you know, relatively equal. And you know, a lot of people found that very hard to believe that that kind of system would work. So, all right. There are some maybe modern day conflict theorists who kind of took it in a little bit of a different place. Probably the most popular of those is C. Wright Mills, and he came up with this idea of the power elite. And that if you look in politics and business and the military, you have just that kind of a handful of people that have a lot of power because they own, you know, the media companies, and they own the lobbyist groups that are sending lots of money to politicians to encourage them to do different things in law, and in the military, you know, deciding which countries we're going to send military aid to and which countries we're not, and things like that. So I think we're going to move on from there. The third perspective here is the feminist perspective, and this perspective says that the best way of understanding what's going on in society is to look at how we define gender. And so, and again, gender are the attitudes, the beliefs, the values that we place on top of someone's sex. So someone's born, you know, as a male, and then we say, okay, well, being a male, here's the expectations for you as a male. You know, you play with blocks, you wear blue, you grow up to be an engineer or a construction worker, you know, you speak loudly, you know, you drink beer, you know, those sort of things that we say about what it means to be male in our culture. And so it says this is the problem, that we have defined gender in a way that is unhealthy and unhelpful for both men and women. So and people who identify as non-binary too, I should say that. And that's the problem. Because you're setting people up for inequality, and you're setting up group conflict, and you know you're dooming men, you know, to die earlier than women, because you're telling men that, you know, only women are supposed to cry, and only women are supposed to show frustration and feelings of helplessness, and so that causes men to, you know, not reach out to other people, but to reach out to other things like, you know, alcohol or pornography or things like that. Patriarchy is where men have power, and they are valued, and then they dominate women. All right, so this is the last and the fourth and last perspective here, interactionist, or sometimes it's referred to as social interactionism, here by Herbert Blumer. And this is the idea that we create a social reality on a one-on-one basis every time we interact with someone, and we know how to interact with them based upon language, because of the words that they're saying and how they're saying them, and then the symbols, the way they're dressing, whether they, you know, they have a beard or not, and their hairstyle, and all those things are communicating to us about them and how we're supposed to interact with them. You know, so, you know, here's an example. Like I tell my students, you know, when you're applying for a job, you know, you don't want to look down at the floor, because that is communicating something about who you are as a person. You want to, you know, look confident and, you know, stand up straight and look people in the eye, because that is going to shape their perception of you. That's going to create a social reality, and people are then going to respond to that reality, right? But it's not just how we hold ourselves. Other things too, like if someone appears to be a male, then we will respond to them differently than if they appear to be a female. So this kind of goes back. This is the perspective where social constructionism kind of comes from. This idea that social problems only exist because we define them as being problems. Like alcoholism has, again, it's been around for a long time, but we didn't define it always as being a social problem. Drug use wasn't considered a problem until I think it was like the 1880s when we defined it as a problem. And we defined it as a problem not because things were getting worse necessarily, but because there was a group of people who came to the United States that many Americans didn't like, and so we passed a law prohibiting the drugs that they were using. And so it goes back to this example of child abuse. We defined it as it became a social problem because we defined it as a social problem. So it's this idea that like everything is kind of subjective and things are only real because we say they're real and things of that nature. All right, last thing here, a little bit about the science of sociology. So when they are doing research, they are going to try to understand what causes something and then what are the consequences of these social problems. So for instance, in drugs, what causes somebody to use drugs and what are the consequences of them using drugs. That's kind of your basic research. Applied research is where you are evaluating a law or a policy that's been created and seeing, is it effective, is it not effective, what is the I don't know, what is the research of a Zoom meeting, for instance. A lot more Zoom meetings are occurring today than they were 5 years ago, so you could do some applied research to find out like what is the implications of doing Zoom, for instance. All right, variables is a term that's important in academia, and a variable is something that is worth studying, that you're looking at. And a lot of times there are two different types of variables that are looked at. One is the thing that is creating the change, right? Like we do a Zoom meeting, right? That's the variable we are studying, and then what we really want to know is like how effective is the meeting given that it's on Zoom. So like if you have a face-to-face meeting, is it more effective than if you have a Zoom meeting? So what we're really interested in is the value of the meeting, but we're studying specifically like what happens if you change it from face-to-face to Zoom. So variable, the definition there is like kind of vague, but it's just something that's looked at, studied. So in sociology, like every science, you're going to have a hypothesis. This is a tentative statement. It just means that it is like, for now, we're going to say this is what we think might happen. And it's about two variables and their relationship to each other, right? I just mentioned variables, and there's your independent variable, and that is the one that is expected to account for the change, right? And so going back to my Zoom example, like on a face-to-face engagement, you have this level of effectiveness of the meeting. And then after Zoom, you have this level. And so what caused that change? Well, the independent variable caused that change, right? Now, obviously, I'm not a fan of Zoom meetings, but you might say, well, actually, it's the opposite, Jesse. We did the research and we found out that when we did Zoom and we used that as our independent variable, then the dependent variable, which is the effectiveness, actually went up, right? So I guess you could argue that like the dependent variable is really what you care about in the end. You want an effective meeting. So if Zoom helps, then you'll do it, but if it doesn't, then you'll do something else. The independent thing is the cause or the correlation. So, all right. Quantitative research. Quantitative relates to this idea of quantity. And so if you're just running numbers, and usually a lot of numbers, then it's probably quantitative research. And that is going to be different from qualitative research. Qualitative research would be like if I sat down with you and had a conversation about your experience with meetings, that would be qualitative because it's quality. I'm sitting down having a real conversation about what's going on, and you can tell me your subjective experience, this is what it was like, whereas quantitative, I would just want to know numbers, like how many Zoom meetings have you had, how long did they last, on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective were they, stuff like that. So all of this is well and good, but how do we transform society into being better? How do we take our problem and we create a solution? And so there's 3 ways that are mentioned here. And those would be things like, let's change the policy. Let's take our current social policy that we have related to these things and change it formally, or change at least the program that we have. And so if you think about something like alcoholism, well, we changed the laws related to drinking and driving. We changed that actually back in the late 80s from 0.1 to 0.08. And so that was an example of a social policy that's used to create a social action trying to solve this problem. All right, much of the time you have to have people in the world who are advocating for change. They're writing letters to the editor. They're posting on social media, although I don't feel like that's as effective because everyone's doing that, so it kind of becomes white noise. But they're writing maybe to their politicians, and they're organizing people to go talk to the politicians, and they are educating the community about why things should be different. An example of this related to alcoholism would be MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Right? They're an advocacy group related to this issue. So what else? Social innovation. These are new things. They could be a policy, a program, some kind of advocacy, but it's a different approach than what we've done in the past, trying to get a better result. And so maybe that's related to our cell phones, or that's related to passing a new law, related to, I don't know, what liquor stores can do, or bartenders, or if you're on the road and you see somebody swerving and driving in an unsafe way, maybe we can, I don't know, do some sort of thing on our phone, which we can't do because we're driving. But you get the idea. It's some sort of new, untested approach to try to help this social problem become less of a social problem. So that is all I have for Chapter 1. Thank you for watching.